What if I told you that Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, believes that entering Q3 is already a victory with Ferrari? What is happening with the car? The classification of the Canada 2025 Grand Prix was not just one more session for Lewis Hamilton. It was a mirror in which Ferrari's current limits were reflected, with total rawness. 5th in the timetable, yes, but more than 6/10 of first place. An eternity in modern Formula One. But the most significant was not the final position, but the body language, the tone of voice, and the words that the heptacampion chose when descending from the car. We are talking about a circuit where Hamilton has been practically unbeatable, a route that dominates as the palm of his hand and where he has offered memorable performances throughout his career. But in this edition, not even his historical domain was sufficient to compensate for the structural deficiencies of the SF-25. And that hit him hard. His gaze no longer contained the brightness of the expectation, but the shadow of disenchantment. The data is overwhelming. George Russell with the Mercedes marked the pole with a 1:10,899. Hamilton in the same circuit needed 1:11.526. It is not just a technical margin, it is a symbolic abyss. The same man who led the absolute domain with Mercedes now fights to stay within the top 5. That difference in performance encapsulates a whole narrative of contained frustration. During the weekend, training already left worrying signs. In the first session, Hamilton showed an acceptable rhythm, but in the second, after applying supposedly beneficial technical changes, the car did not respond. In fact, the performance worsened. It was not a lack of effort. He and his team gave everything to find a competitiveness window. But the car was not there. The problem is not attitude. The problem is SF-25. Hamilton talked about constant rear blockages, of a feeling of imbalance when braking in the final chicane, of a car that does not translate work on track into competitive times. They are symptoms of a badly born car, or at least of a car that has not yet found its essence. For a pilot looking for centimeter to centimeter, this technical uncertainty is not only frustrating, it is alienating. The most disturbing of his statements was not the modesty of his expectations, but the acceptance of classifying within the top 10 could become a recurring challenge. For someone with 7 titles in the world who has fought against the greatest in history, to say that entering Q3 is difficult but not impossible is not humility. It is resignation disguised as diplomacy. The general scene was almost symbolic. Hamilton, with Ferrari's red, walking only after getting out of the car, without smiles, without ampullous statements. Only short phrases, measurements, and full of a weight that cannot be simulated. I wasn't upset. I was emotionally exhausted. And that is the most worrying sign for Ferrari. The Scuderia has in its hands one of the greatest talents of all time. But if you fail to offer you a competitive environment, that talent can be extinguished not for lack of speed, but for emotional wear. What we live in Canada was more than a bad classification. It was a warning. And perhaps the first chapter of a much darker story if Ferrari does not react on time. Hamilton is not only fighting his rivals on the track, he is freeing a silent war with his own machine. The Ferrari SF-25, which should be a precision tool at the service of its experience and talent, has become an unpredictable obstacle, an invisible barrier that separates it from its best version as a pilot. The emotional and technical connection that a pilot needs to have with his car simply does not exist at this time. From the beginning of the weekend in Montreal, Hamilton described the car as very different from what I have experienced here in the past. This seemingly innocent phrase is devastating when it comes from someone who knows each meter of that circuit as if it were your home. Hamilton did not speak only of vague sensations. I was denouncing a complete disconnection with the philosophy of the car. The way it responds in braking, how it behaves in low-speed curves, the difficulty in managing dynamic balance in technical sections. All this builds an alienation narrative between the pilot and its work tool. Ferrari, in his search to improve performance, has fallen into the trap of excessively complicating a car that should be more intuitive for pilots. The aerodynamic load is distributed irregularly, the reactions of the car in borderline situations are not predictable, and the adjustments that are made between sessions do not translate into tangible improvements. This situation is particularly serious for someone like Hamilton, whose adaptation capacity has always been one of their most lethal weapons. But not even your talent can compensate for an erratic technical basis. The most alarming thing is that Hamilton acknowledged that he had underestimated the adaptation process. He believed that, with his experience, he could accelerate integration with Ferrari. But he met a wall. A car that, instead of allowing you to focus on extracting the last thousandths from each curve, forces you to think about each braking entry, each weight transfer, each pedal adjustment. When a Hamilton-caliber pilot has to survive on each return instead of attacking, something is deeply bad in the conception of the car. And the problem is not just technical. It is also psychological. This disconnection generates distrust, and distrust kills performance. In Formula One, when the pilot doubts the car, he begins to lift his foot, stop before, avoid risks. That mental microcognition separates it from its natural limit, and that in this category means losing key positions. The loss of trust is not evident to the eye of the viewer, but it manifests in the data. Inconsistent times, unexpected reactions, blockages in critical areas, and most worrying, a body language that transmits frustration and exhaustion. Ferrari has a silent crisis. The car that had to relaunch Hamilton's career and return the team to the top is breaking the most sacred relationship in this sport, that of the pilot with his machine. While other teams such as McLaren and Mercedes have managed to find a point of balance between innovation and usability, Ferrari seems caught in a spiral of redesigns that disconnect the pilot instead of empowering him. And when the car does not answer, when every attempt to improve results in more questions than answers, morality collapses. For Hamilton, accustomed to dominate from trust, this new scenario is emotionally unpacking. His gestures say everything. It is not just the time per return. It is the absence of trust. And without trust, there is no possible glory. Lewis Hamilton's words after the classification in Canada were not just a technical evaluation of his performance. They were an emotional radiography of a pilot who, for the first time in a long time, seems to carry the weight of his own legend. His statements were not aggressive or loaded with drama, but precisely because of that, they were even more shocking. There was a disturbing serenity in his tone, the calm of someone who begins to accept that his best days could not return if circumstances do not change soon. And that acceptance, coming from someone like Hamilton, is an alarm signal for Ferrari and for the entire Formula One. What moves is not what he said, but how he said it. It will be difficult, he said about his goal of staying in the top 5. Entering Q3 will be a challenge. These phrases, which could go unnoticed in the mouth of a rookie pilot, are devastating when a heptacampion of the world pronounces them. They reveal a deep crack in their motivation, not because he has lost hunger, but because he knows that he is competing with tools that are not up to it. Hamilton's frustration is no longer someone who expects an immediate improvement. It is that of someone who has begun to understand that, no matter how much pushes, there is no possible miracle without a car that supports it. This is the same man who, for years, was synonymous with excellence, who dominated the hybrid era with an almost inhuman superiority, and who converted every weekend of the race into a perfect execution lesson. But now his narrative has changed. He is no longer the absolute leader of an unbeatable empire. He is an experienced warrior caught in a project that does not respond, and that, emotionally, wears it. There is no quick turn to compensate for it. There is no press conference that hides it. It shows in his gaze, in his pauses, in the way he lowers his head after speaking. There is an implicit sadness in its nonverbal language that shouts stronger than any headline. Emotional wear is not born from a bad career. It is born from repetition. To know that what happened in Canada was no exception, but possibly the new normality. It is born from the impotence of seeing that the effort is not enough. That meetings with engineers, the hours in simulator, the last-minute adjustments do not produce the necessary qualitative leap. For someone like Hamilton, accustomed to transforming every detail into an advantage, this scenario is a nightmare. Not because of the wounded pride, but for the lost time. Because every race that passes is a race less in its attempt to achieve something great with Ferrari. And this is where the emotional message becomes powerful. Hamilton is not accusing the team. He is not looking guilty. He is sharing his truth with stark honesty. He is saying between the lines that he continues to believe, but that is increasingly difficult to do it. That your commitment is not in doubt, but that your hope begins to weaken. And that, in a sport as mental as Formula One, is the prelude to a dangerous disconnection. What happened in the classification of Canada goes far beyond a timetable or a grid position. It was a silent but forceful statement of the current state of the Ferrari-Hamilton project. The words of the British, loaded with Mabel and realism, must be understood as an urgent call to introspection within Maranello. Do not wait for shouting to know that something is going wrong. Hamilton is already talking, and is doing it from a place that mixes disappointment, exhausted patience, and hope that it costs more to sustain. Ferrari cannot afford to repeat that cycle with Hamilton, because this is not any pilot. He is the man who changed the rules of the game in an entire era. He is the competitor who challenged the greatest and wrote his name with the legends such as Senna, Prost, and Schumacher. Having it in your ranks is not an eternal privilege. It is an urgent responsibility. And this urgency is not solved with vague promises of future updates or speeches about the car potential. Ferrari must offer tangible results, not only to meet its sporting objectives, but to emotionally recover Hamilton. The link between pilot and equipment is fractured. I do not broken at all, but worn out. And in a sport where tenets are also built on mutual trust, that crack can be deadly. The Canada 2025 classification will remain in the archives as another technical point in the season. But for those who understand the language of the great pilots, it will be remembered as the moment when Lewis Hamilton, without raising his voice, made it clear that time ends. There is still room to react. But if Ferrari does not act already, he can lose much more than a race.